Kim, first thing, is it actually faster than ever before? Do you see that?
Absolutely, absolutely. Look, I think that we all have experienced this on so many multidimensional levels. We're in a math equation where every single variable is moving at one time. I think secondly, when you just look at traditional boundaries, there are no more data boundaries. You have democratization of data. There are no more national, state, global boundaries. Everything moves. When you look at the trust equation with social contracts evaporating, consumer expectations. So I think, for me, I think of it as just a multivariable equation, where as a director, all of those components are moving at one time. And then finally, I would say the ability to predict is almost evaporated, whether it's from an FP&A standpoint or from a board standpoint. Your ability to figure out what are the leading and lagging indicators has almost gone poof. So if you put all of that together, I would submit without a doubt we are in unbelievable strategic change that is just faster than ever before in society.
I love the way that you described it, this systems thinking.
Yes, yes.
For a long time, we used to say, when a butterfly flaps its wings in Africa,
yes,
it causes the butterfly effect, and you have a tornado over here or a hurricane over here. We are now in a business model where we can actually look at that system with what is happening with technology, with what's happening with data,
yes,
and we can start to predict what might happen.
that's right.
You're in the midst of three industries that I think are disrupting very rapidly.
Yeah.
Energy is in the midst of transition, and you can start to see that occurring. You can start to see that we might be on the cusp of healthcare really making a big breakthrough in terms of lifetimes and the way that we care for people. And then, technology has been a huge disruptor. And I say, infinite technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Yeah.
So we are in the midst of all three of those, and boards that you sit on are connected with all of those. Give us a little bit about how you see that being seen by boards in terms of that rate of disruption, and how do they think about it?
Yeah. I'd love to have a brainstorming session in this conference to talk about what is the right word. We talked about this at dinner last night. Is it really transition for any of these industries? Because that implies a from to, and I would argue it's not a from to, it's more diversification. In almost every aspect, you're dealing with multiple things at the same time. Is it revolutionary? Well, in some sense it is, but I would argue we're not all going to be in energy driving EVs yesterday as many people, or tomorrow as many people predicted. So there's something about transition, transformation, diversification that I think as a board we have to think about what that paradigm is, because when we talk to our stakeholders, I find in conversations in a society that's already pretty much fact-free or scientific-free as a base, it makes the conversations harder. And so we have trouble, I think, articulating what is that framework or paradigm with our stakeholders, with our investors, and I think that often causes a lot of confusion. And I believe a board, and some of my boards, are really helping to think about how do we define that better so we don't become part of the confusion, part of the expectation gap. And then I would just say, and we'll get into this a little bit later, at least as an old securities lawyer, the board calendar was driven by the SEC calendar, by 10 Qs and 10 Ks, and you had a rhythm for your board meetings that had some level of semblance that made sense. And I would just submit from my experience that calendar almost no longer makes sense because things are changing so rapidly. AI doesn't wait for your next year-long strategy meeting in a year or your next quarterly meeting. So I think one of the things I feel is a sense of almost urgency and a healthy discomfort with adopting the traditional board calendar of framework and communications. And we'll talk about this, but something needs to radically change with how we use our board time and how that board calendar needs to be, I think, reinvented for how fast things are changing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it would make a lot of sense, right? Because if the inputs are changing that rapidly,
that's right,
and you still continued to execute
that's right,
with a cadence that hasn't changed in a long time,
that's right,
then there's a disconnect that evolves over time. Yeah. No, fantastic. Jonathan, you've been in a variety of industries, food, retail, tech. And in some ways, these have been at the core of the advancement of civilization. I always think of something that really started us on our journey as a species being the big advancements in agriculture that were made over time. Boards are seeing technology front and center. This is a disruption that we kind of know about. Are there other disruptions that have become faster that are on your mind that you'd like to talk about? For instance, there is a huge amount of disparity in food production in the world. Some parts of the world it's nearly free, in others not so. So talk to us about that. Are those disruptions also getting faster?
Well, disruption's clearly getting faster, and I think it's faster across the board. But I think one thing that directors need to think about is every disruption is hyped as a game-changing disruption. 4 years ago, blockchain technology was going to change the world. 2 years ago, I spoke at the National Directors event to a standing room only crowd on the metaverse. Those things felt like they were, game-changing disruptors, and so far haven't proven to be. AI, we read this week in the Amazon CEO letter, it's more disruptive than fire or electricity. Maybe. I think it's going to be disruptive, but I think every disruption is hyped is probably bigger than it is. And I think directors in our position sometimes need to step back and say, okay, is that really the case? Or are we running from one shiny thing to another, too worried about things? In the areas you talked about, I think in retail, one of the things I worry about the most is what do wars do to our business? So much of product that American consumers, world consumers consume comes from China or China-adjacent countries. What will, if we have a Ukraine-type event in Taiwan, what disruptions does that have on retail? When I think about food production, droughts, floods, fires, climate change things are a really big deal. And these are negative disruptions that we think and worry about. But on the same front, next week I'm going to be meeting with a bunch of startup companies in the ag tech space on how we grow more with less water, how we better put nutrients in the soil so that things work well in a changing climate. So there are negative disruptions we need to guard against, but there are positive disruptions that we need to march toward and look for.
Yeah, no, I totally love this combinatorial effect that you're hitting on. Because of what is happening with technology, I will know precisely how much fertilizer to put to a plant, and therefore I can increase crop yields dramatically. And it is typically when these combinatorial effects start to hit that you find that you've missed something. It is not the individual effects that you miss, it is the combinatorial effects that you miss.
I do believe disruption is, with everything, creates opportunity and it creates risk. But the other component from sort of a societal stakeholder, I would say leadership role, is it also does feel like disruption can oftentimes create more inequality or create a differentiated impact on disenfranchised individuals. So whether you talk about HP and its commitment to digital equity, we saw the difference in COVID of who had a computer and who didn't was night and day. Whether you talk about Marathon Petroleum and access to energy, it's the difference between life and the difference between quality of life. Whether you talk about Johns Hopkins and adequate to healthcare. So food is one, but I think as I step back and look across the boards, across the industry, across society, the speed of disruption and it's also the impact of disruption on who. So often it's many of the similar groups who are left out. So that's something to think about our role as companies and boards.